Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I hope you can stand another piece of paper. I think it'll help us deal with the issues which we need to deal with, and they're a little bit on the dry and formal side, at least to begin with. So perhaps have another cup of coffee, and that will do. Actually, I said a few words last evening about what I want to really concentrate on today, and that is on truth and why it is absolute or non-relative. And if you will forgive me, I'm going to be rather careful and slow. You might even think picky about this, but it really is a matter of getting us to very carefully focus our minds on something that great confusion has been created around. So if you now have the sheet and you care to begin to follow me there, there is a current crisis about truth in our world, but most especially in our university. It is somewhat ironic that in the 20s and 30s, for example, philosophers wrote books defending what is today called the absoluteness of truth and explaining the follies of thinking of it as relative. If you will, for example, look at an old book by an old philosopher by the name of W.P. Montague called The Ways of Knowing. You can be sure it is in your library because it was very well known and widely used at the time. The Ways of Knowing. I believe it's chapter 3, if I'm not mistaken. In any case, you'll be able to find it just by looking at the index. You'll see a very careful discussion of the idea that truth might be relative and a way of understanding why people might be led to that mistake. And actually, among philosophers of the traditional variety, the idea that truth might be relative is an opinion which is frankly laughable. The situation we have come to where this becomes an issue is very recent and has to do with political and social ideals that have felt the idea that truth as something absolute is threatening and difficult to deal with and keep what you regard as your human dignity in place because after all it's not a very comfortable position to be wrong, is it? And so if you're faced with a situation where you're told, in the words of Aristotle, that there are many ways to be wrong, only one way to be right. That immediately sounds antisocial in our context, doesn't it? And if you're deeply worried about this, and you have perhaps been marginalized, as we now say, you may have the idea that the one who's going to turn out to be wrong is you. And these are deep issues. Now, and I want you to understand that I understand that they are deep issues and difficult issues. I'm not dismissing them. And currently I'm just pointing out that there is a deep social drive against the idea of truth as being one way. Now, this has created real problems for us in the intellectual world. And I don't hesitate to say that nearly all, I would say all, but I just don't want to have to argue about some one case. I would say nearly all of our fields of professional practice are in epistemic crisis. That is to say, in nearly all of our fields of practice, law, education, theology, medicine, in nearly all of our fields of practice, instead of going for knowledge, what we go for is accepted practice. And so what we have is, as one social critic of a few years ago said, standardization without standards. And standardization is necessary in order to stay out of trouble with your clients, your colleagues, and the law. But you don't have to have truth for that, and you don't have knowledge for that. You only have to follow accepted practice. And the current crisis of truth in our world generally, and in this regard, the universities are certainly at the center, has to do with the fact that we no longer have a point of appeal that is common, objective, able to provide a common ground for basis of discussion and interaction. And so in the absence of that, we replace, as is often done in discussions in the universities today, we say it is not an issue of truth, it is not an issue of logic, it is an issue of power. And in a very ironic way, Nietzsche triumphs, who at the end of the 19th century, in a very prophetic way, read how the intellectual winds were blowing and said that the final word in every area of human life is not truth, not knowledge, but power. So there is a real crisis here now, and I want to just turn aside and take us back to some very elemental things and try to help us focus on truth itself. In many contexts, this is laughable immediately. But I want to try to remove it from that, and I require, I'm afraid, great patience on your part to try to follow me over some very simple things. So I start with the point on your page there that everyone knows perfectly well what truth is. And I want to ask you to think about that with me for a few minutes. Imagine that you were not able to distinguish truth from falsity. Try to put yourself in the world where you were unable to take your own thoughts and determine whether or not they're true. Consider the simple cases. Suppose you're looking for your car keys or your shoes, and you have a thought that you left your car keys in the garage. And now, is it within your competence as a human being to determine whether or not that thought is true? What do you think? Can you determine whether or not that thought is true? How would you do it? You would take that thought where the object is thought to be, and you would compare that thought to the object. Isn't that true? And if you you thought your shoes were in the closet. So you can take that thought to the closet and compare the thought to the closet, can't you? Now, is there anyone here who feels that you could not possibly do that? I'm sure there's no one here who could not do it. I'm sure of that. I'm sure that you all know you could do it. I'm sure that if you thought you couldn't do it, you would immediately just want to send out for help. Because the ability to recognize truth in these kinds of cases is a condition of human competence, of basic human competence. And so let's stay with these cases now for a few minutes. I know that these are not the interesting cases that many of you may want to go to immediately. Let's stay with them for just a few minutes. The structure is the structure of truth, and we learn it very early, and we learn it by experience. We learn to compare our thoughts and our expectations, the statements of others, with what we find to be the case. And if you watch children, they learn this very early, and they have no problem with it at a very early age. And of course, One of the things that children learn to do very early is to instruct their parents about the truth and falsity of various statements which the parents have made. They know that. This is not a deep, dark mystery. A child masters it. And if Johnny stole some cookies and Susie comes and tells Mommy, Johnny stole cookies. Now Mommy sits down with Johnny and says, is it true that you took cookies? And if at that point Johnny says, what is truth? You see. You know what Johnny is doing. Johnny is being uncooperative. He is not responding to the point. And it is very important for us to understand that it is on the human agenda, right up close to the top, for everyone to be very careful about the truth. Because the truth is dangerous. And Johnny knows that if indeed it is established that he took the cookies, a certain course of action is in the wings. And so the little girl asked to define a lie in Sunday school replied, it is an abomination to God and a very present help in time of trouble. Because you see, our ability to negotiate with the truth. Now, all of that comes from the very simple, obvious nature of truth. For example, if you work in a place where you change shifts, you may have an inventory list. And when the shift change comes on, the one who's taking over may take the inventory list and go to the cabinet, and if you're a nurse, for example, may go and inventory the drugs or inventory whatever it is. It's a very familiar situation. And the person is able to look at the inventory, compare it to the reality which the inventory is about, and decide whether or not the inventory states what is the case. Isn't that true? And so I ask you to focus on that relationship between the inventory and what it is about. And if what it is about is as the inventory states, the inventory is correct. The guy checks you off, you can go home, watch the news. If it is not correct, there's a discussion. Right? It's very important to think about that. Now, you don't have to have a written piece of paper. You don't have to have language. This is a very important part of the story, folks, and I'm sorry to deal with it in such a superficial way. You can carry the inventory in your mind. It doesn't have to be written on a piece of paper. Language, let me just make a statement for those of you who are philosophically worried about these things. Language takes its semantic properties from the minds of those who use it. Meaning and truth are fundamentally properties not of pieces of paper or strings of phonemes, but of thoughts, ideas. Now, this is one of the problems in the background of the discussion about relativity of truth. Because in our time, the mind has been thrown away. It's been thrown away, and a lot of the philosophical search for truth proceeds on the condition that you can't talk about the mind in any intelligible way anyway, and you have to talk about language. It is the mind that provides the substance for truth. The mind in relationship to the objects which the mind deals with. Our culture lost the mind at the end of the 18th century at a philosophical level in the writings of David Hume and Immanuel Kant. It lost it as a subject matter of serious research and knowledge, and ever since has been trying to find it again. And language and behavior are, of course, the two main subjects that are proposed as the mind or as the access to the mind more subtly perhaps brain chemistry. And I don't have time to go into all of that, and I'm sorry that I have to just skate over it. But these are offered as substitutes, and when you examine brain chemistry, behavior, and language at the level of naturalistic knowledge, you cannot find meaning, and you cannot find truth. But of course, when you go to check the inventory in the cabinet so that you can go home, you don't worry about those things. You know what you're thinking, don't you? There are 3 bottles of such and such in the cabinet. You're thinking that, and you actually know how to look in the cabinet and see whether or not that thought is true. You can compare your thoughts to the objects. So now my third point here is an attempt to just give you an abstract statement of what truth is. Truth is that peculiar relationship which obtains between a representation and what it is about, when what it is about is as the representation indicates. And I turn you back now and I say, every one of you, you don't need a course in philosophy, you don't need a course in linguistics, every one of you deals with truth and falsity constantly. Every one of you know exactly what it is. You're able to identify it, argue about it, refute it, defend it, question it. You know exactly what it is. And you cannot go anywhere in this discussion if you give up on that basic insight about what truth is and how it's present to you. If you give up on that, there will be no stopping place or no intelligibility in the discussion about truth. Why are we in fact at a loss about truth today? It's because, generally speaking, truth as it is in itself is not an intellectually respectable subject matter in the academic and learned world. Brain chemistry? Fine. Language? Oh, that's good. Behavior? That's good too. But it will never get you to anything that you will recognize as truth. So you see, there is a very serious problem about truth, because truth falls in a domain of reality and knowledge which is not intellectually kosher. Now, do people go on and act as if they know the truth? Sure they do. I always ask a colleague or fellow professional who says truth is relative, I say, do you believe that of the truth about your fringe benefits? That it's relative? That it depends on what you believe about it? Now, you know, they may choke it down and say yes. Or they may say, no, it's a power play. And if I've got enough power, what I say about my fringe benefits will stick, and if I don't, then what the administration says about my fringe benefits will stick. Just a power play. And if we go to the courts, just more power. Truth is not established in court. Decisions are reached. Power is exercised. Well, that's another part of the long story. Now, let me just point out a very crucial matter here. Not all truth, of course, is verifiable in the way I've suggested. You can establish the truth of your belief that your shoes are in the closet in the way I've described. But it's not possible to establish most of the truths that we're interested in the academic world in that way. We have to use other means of evidence. The basic laws of logic are designed to enable you to get from true premises to other statements that must be true if your premises are true. That's the standard stuff for those of you who know a little logic. And so it is possible by using logic to proceed beyond things that can be directly verified. When I use the phrase directly verified, I do not write into it the history of empiricism, which is responsible in large measure for the mess we're in about truth and knowledge. Our culture has not escaped the effects of Hume's critique of knowledge on the assumption of empiricism, that is, that all meaningful statements, all ideas come from sense perception or feeling. And if you have bought that, then of course truth goes out, personality goes out, value goes out, sets go out, universals go out. Everything goes out actually that makes human life worth living. I mean, Hume knew that. And that's why he got sick with his own philosophy and disoriented and said, well, I have to get up out of the philosophical armchair and walk about, play a little backgammon, chat with ladies, have dinner, and I feel better. Right? But that's because when he moved into the realm of action, he had to step out of the philosophical armchair that had dissolved his whole world around him. So when I speak of verifiability, I do not mean empirical verifiability. I mean verifiability by direct experience, and direct experience is not to be understood as Hume tried to understand it, and later philosophers commonly known as positivists or logical empiricists or whatever. So, but what we have to understand is that truth still persists in cases where you can't directly verify it. Let me give you a parallel. Take the relation of next to. Now, as I ask you, is the pepper next to the salt on your table? You would be able to answer me one way or the other, wouldn't you? And how would you be able to do that? Well, by looking at the pepper and the salt. Do you know what the relation of next to is? Well, you probably haven't thought much about it, but if you thought about it a bit, I expect you'd come out fairly clear on it. It is not a precise relationship, and indeed there is some vagueness in it. Do things have to be right up against one another to be next to? Well, that's a clear case, but maybe if they were a fraction of an inch away, they would be next to. Suppose the salt was on one side of the table and the pepper on the other side. Would that be next to? Probably not. Next to normally means some kind of spatial proximity, but it isn't very precise. If there is, however, a plate between the salt and the pepper, you won't say it's next to the pepper, because it isn't. So, for example, we might say, is Mars next to the Earth in the solar system? What would the answer be? Well, you would be prepared to draw some distinctions. You would say, if you mean there is another planet between them, then Mars is next to the Earth. If you mean it's right up against it, no, it's not next to it. And so you can draw distinctions, right? Now here's my point. You know what next to is, you apply it, you learn it by observation, and as a result, you can apply it far beyond observation. Truth is the same way. Truth is not limited to observation. It does not depend on observation any more than next to does. Now then, if I've succeeded in getting this before you, let's go on and make some statements about it. And right at the bottom of your sheet, I say truth is absolutely relentless, ruthless, and unrelenting. I mean, it just stands there. It does not change because of people's beliefs about it, how they vote on it, what their tradition says, or anything of the sort. If your gas tank is empty and you believe that it has gas in it, you can vote on it, have a cheerleading session, develop a tradition. You can do anything you want to, and your car will still not run. Truth is absolutely ruthless and unrelenting. You cannot change any truth by believing one thing or another about it. Now you can change things if it is within your power to modify what your belief is about. For example, if you say my tank has gas in it and it doesn't, then you can, as it were, make that sentence true by putting some gas in the tank. But you cannot do anything about it by just believing or wishing or hoping or taking attitudes or cheering or booing or anything of that sort. Truth itself is absolutely ruthless and unrelenting. Now compare that to belief. Now, I note at the bottom here, I must hurry on, that truth is no respecter of persons. It doesn't matter if it's Joe that believes it, or John that believes it, or Betty, or Bill Clinton, or Newt Gingrich, or anybody else. It will not go from truth to false just because a different person believes it. Now, belief, of course, is different. Belief, I have very simply stated, the top of the other side of your page there, is a readiness to act as if something were so. Belief has a lot of properties that are true for representations that are true. For example, a belief is about something. It is selective in the way any representation is. A belief always has a definite kind of object. If I believe that there is gas in my tank, I'm not in other facts, for example, about what's happening on the freeway or elsewhere, what's going on here, is irrelevant to it, because that belief is a representation which selects a specific object. The difference now between belief and truth is that they vary independently. You can believe what is true, you can believe what is false. There is no necessary connection between belief and truth, and thereby hangs many a tale. So you actually hear people talk as if somehow they varied with one another, that believing made things true. I've heard people speak in such a way that it would seem that it was impossible to have a false belief, because after all, if you believe it, it's true for you, isn't it? And you have to admit that that's a pretty radical interpretation of truth. Or perhaps it's relativized to groups, perhaps professional organizations. Whatever all of the world's leading philosophers believe must be true. You're not likely to hear that said, because the world generally believes, as you may have heard, that if all the leading philosophers were laid end to end, they would still not reach a conclusion. But if you hear it said all the world's leading microbiologists, then perhaps that would be more impressive. But the truth of the matter is, all of the world's leading microbiologists can believe what is wrong. So there is no correlation between belief and truth that is automatic. If you're going to establish a correlation, you have to go beyond belief. You have to move towards evidence. Now, quickly, why then is it that truth is so threatening? And it is because truth carries claims to truth, and truth carries an authority that belief does not. If you have a belief and you want to have it to have authority, you have to create some special circumstances that will give it authority. Merely the fact that it is a belief doesn't command any respect. I don't get no respect, Rodney Dangerfield says, and that's exactly the way it is with truth. You tell someone you believe something, and well, that's interesting. And they may make a note of it, because if they have to deal with you and you really believe it, it's going to make a difference. Because belief does make a difference in our behavior. And what we believe rigorously is correlated with how we will act. And I really think we need to say that it is not true, as is often said, that we don't live up to our beliefs. I would just propound to you a suggestion to think about. We always live up to our beliefs. You can't do anything else. Now what you can do is not live up to the beliefs you profess. And a lot of our problems in life are created by the fact that there are sometimes reasons to profess beliefs which we don't have. And so this creates a further gap between belief and reality. But we are really concerned about truth claims, and I put down here this perversion: you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you flee. And we all feel that deeply. And that's actually something that Jesus seems to have had in mind when he said, people love darkness rather than light because their deeds are evil. Right? They want to hide. And the truth is hard to live with, and I'll come back to that in just a moment.